Yeah, so great to be here. Rumi did, of course, a fantastic job of teeing up this topic of Bitcoin and blockchain, and we're going to try and go a little bit deeper on this topic and use Bitcoin as an example to explain blockchain, which is this new technology out there. Bitcoin kind of is the one that kicked off the party, if you will. And so Rumi asked the question, everyone here had heard of Bitcoin, it sounded like. How about something else called Ethereum? Okay, not quite as many hands. Now, how many people have actually owned or used Bitcoin before? Well, that's actually bigger than I thought. Wow. How about that? So it's true that we live in this global world now today. And commerce races forward, extends from Hong Kong to London to New York. We have financial systems that connect all of these places. And this is the reality, of course, the world we live in today. However, that reality tends to be a bit different if we truly look across the globe more broadly. 2.5 billion people that don't have banks today. And those of us in this room with credit cards, we're actually in the minority of the world's population to have a credit card. Even if we turn around and look at the United States, we have close to about 10% of the population entirely without a bank account whatsoever. Another group of people that, in some form or fashion, about 1 in 5, really don't have access to the same level of financial services that we do as well. Yet, this digital disruption, these new technologies, they are, in fact, finding their ways into the hands of different individuals across the globe. So just over the past 4 years, 4x growth in smartphone penetration in Africa. This is smartphones, not simple little brick phone, but actually smartphones, Android devices, and so forth. India and Latin America, we're already up to 1/3 of all individuals now have a smartphone in their hands in these countries as well. So now let's imagine for a minute this fisherman in Chile can send an instant, near zero cost payment on a completely open platform to Shanghai on a platform that has absolutely no barriers whatsoever. We have this world where we can deliver services from India to the United States nearly instantly. Of course, information flows all over the world nearly instantly. In fact, we can even ship products and goods in mere days to various different parts of the world. We could ship this chair to remote places in Africa or Southeast Asia or what have you, and the recipient would actually, in order to send a payment back, would actually require more time for that payment to move than the actual chair itself. And so in order to get into a little bit about Bitcoin and blockchain technology, this is a bit of what part of kind of the driver is for some of this. And so before we actually get into the technology, again, a next click of detail, let's take a little tour through history, because even for myself, when I first heard of this technology, the fact that some group of people somehow out there could actually create a new form of money was a bit absurd in many ways. But after we actually really study what money is, it shouldn't actually be that strange at all. Anyone know what the first form of money was out there? There's a lot of talk about, well, of course there was barter, and then we kind of moved on from that. If we went to the anthropology department, history department at any university here that any of us attended, and we asked them, they'll tell us that barter never actually even existed intra-civilization. It was only used inter-civilization. And what was actually used for those individuals to transact with each other? Well, it's of course up on the graph here. It's memory, right? So if someone had some extra, just let's dial it back thousands upon thousands of years, some extra meat or what have you, and an individual chose to give some to another person there in their civilization, they would simply both remember that that event had occurred, about the amount of it, about the time that it happened, And what were they recording? They were recording the existence of that transaction and the fact that there was a debt to be paid. And that other recipient would look to repay that debt at a future time. And so simply, this was the first form of money, effectively just recording that a transaction existed, and therefore locked in each person's memory was, in fact, value in that regard. Very, very interesting. Of course, as civilizations grew, this became untenable, clearly, to use memory as our means to record all of the various different transactions, ensure that they were settled out at some future date. So we began to replace the use of memory with various different other objects to record. Hey, let's use this little thing here, whatever it might be, to denote that, that this transaction occurred. And we've, of course, formalized all of this over time and with the emergence of what are called fiat currencies that were effectively just a database managed by another group, which typically have been governments. And we get to where we're at today, where money actually, now that we have the technology where it is today, is in fact just a database. Set of databases that are very important databases that are actually a huge amount of care is taken with regard to ensure the security of those databases. It's obviously very critical, but that's where we are today. And so what is really actually makes up money? Well, I kind of maintain just kind of this tour through history here. There's really a few different pieces. And it starts first and foremost with this ledger or database to basically record transactions. And in our world today, that's effectively the US dollar accounts and bills, right? And we have all kinds of different US dollar bank accounts across here in the United States that manage this database or record of transactions. We, of course, access those records in those databases via some mechanism, and we have banks that allow us to do that. And they provide an interface, whatever it might be. Today it's online, it could be walking in person, you name it. And there, of course, needs a mechanism to kind of settle all of the transactions across all of these various different banks. And we have a central bank here in the United States that does that, and this is the same structure for the most part where money exists across the globe today in all various different countries. So what does that lead to? Well, it leads to basically an architecture that looks a little bit something like this. And Rumi kind of called this out a little bit more. But we, of course, have the various different banks there. Individuals and businesses and entities interact with those various different banks. They, in turn, interact with the central bank. And we end up with this fairly hierarchical structure to record and maintain all these transactions. So what is the blockchain? This is just an absurd concept. How could this even possibly exist? Well, I'll maintain it's effectively these same few pieces, really. So first and foremost, Bitcoin has a database, and it's received a name which is called the Bitcoin blockchain, and it has one job. This database records every transaction that has ever happened in the history of the network is recorded in this database. Now, the way we access this database is and store this database is a little bit different. It's entirely peer-to-peer, which is very different. And so all the participants themselves actually store copies of this full database and work together to maintain the integrity of this database to ensure that that database and the recorded set of transactions are, in fact, accurate. And, of course, we need settlement rules here, and they're a little bit different in the Bitcoin world because it is an entirely peer-to-peer system maintained by the participants. The settlement rules are therefore open source and also enforced by the participants as well. And so we end up with a system that looks a little bit like this. And this is kind of what Rumi called out earlier in this picture. This is really where she was leading to with that description. It's an entirely peer-to-peer system where each of these different participants maintain a copy of the records and ensure that they are all in sync with each other. And so this is kind of the picture that we have. And what's interesting is this picture, for those with an IT and engineering technology background, actually should look somewhat familiar. The internet itself was built with this model in mind. This is, in fact, the structure and the architecture of TCP/IP and all of these other protocols that allow us to communicate with each other on the internet on this open platform. So it's a very similar architecture in that regard. We have many different protocols that we use, some more than others, but that allow us to surf the web and exchange emails. They're layer on top of each other that make up the internet today. All of those pieces of the puzzle, of course, fit together, and many believe we've had a missing piece to that puzzle, and that there has been no protocol for value exchange thus far ever built for the internet using the same architecture as the internet on the internet. And this is the first pass at that new protocol for the exchange of value on the internet. What does that lead to? That leads to a system that's a number of different things: open, low cost, fast, always on, programmable, flexible, and immutable. We won't have time to really dig into all of these attributes, but I might try and look at dive in a little bit more on that first one, the openness of the platform, because this is something very different. If all of these different peers out there can access this same database, can look at it, download it, review it, this is something drastically different than our world today, where we have these very important databases, the US dollar network. And for the most part, unless anyone here works at the Federal Reserve or certain departments in Treasury Department at banks, have never seen it. Never. Never seen what that actual database looks like. But in the Bitcoin world, anyone can go down. That laptop over there is a full copy of the entire database. And so that kind of lends itself to many different things that are entirely different that we were never able to experience before. So you can view the entire trajectory of the Bitcoin economy over time. And this is what it's looked like so far. This is basically the number of transactions per day over time, as we can map them. And again, anyone can go out, pull this data at any point in time and kind of see how that's trending. Of course, what that means is people are going to try and grab this data and do something with it. Probably the first thing that would come to mind for someone to do something with this data was probably try and make money off it. And so here's a kind of a hedge fund investment firm, Pantera Capital, that has published some work. This is a little bit old to try and make the claim that they're working on some of this. And this is mapping the price of a given Bitcoin versus that transaction volume. And you can see they kind of diverge quite a bit and then converge again. And their belief is that they should more or less track each other, and any kind of divergent trend from those two tracking might lead to an opportunity for them. They, of course, are looking to make projections into the future as well. But again, anyone has access to this data and can then pull this down and actually make those same decisions. For the traders, investors, there's no more waiting until I don't know, the days of the month or what have you to get the reports from the Fed on various different economic measures and so forth. That doesn't exist. This is real time. At any point in time, you can see this move. The actual monetary policy, we won't have enough time to really dig into this, but this is also open, and it happens to be deterministic at this point. It's quite deterministic and defined up as part of the protocol itself. And that is effectively by nature of all of the different participants needing to align and agree on a specific policy. So it is true that there is a certain schedule for new Bitcoins coming into existence. There's only going to be 21 million in total as we play forward, and that kind of moves across in time, and we see the new issuance. And again, this is entirely open and deterministic. Likewise for fees, this would be another thing kind of akin to seeing in real time the actual fees charged by the U.S. financial system or what have you. You can kind of see all of that transparently out there. And the rules for all of this, what are they actually? What are these rules actually? Well, there was a first set of rules, much the same as those underlying protocols of the internet, really just a set of rules that are defined in what's called a protocol. And they happen to be initially published in a white paper by an individual or group of individuals with the pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto. And they were published out there for everyone to read. And in order to participate in the network, you can either choose to adopt the protocol or not. And you would participate in perhaps another network with a different protocol. Much the same as the internet itself, again. And today, how do we actually, where do we actually go and see if there's any, if the network actually agrees to make any changes to the protocol? Well, this is all kind of stored in software, right? This is how it's defined and captured moving forward. And so this is kind of the law of Bitcoin is now encoded. It's encoded in software, and that's kind of where the truth lies. Where again, anyone can actually go and read the policy, if you will, of the network. All the transactions in real time. This is a website, Blockchain Info, where you can kind of just see them scrolling by, several transactions a second there. It's much more fun to see it in real time. You can, of course, even look to specific transactions now, which is kind of interesting. Here's some, fairly dense data information up top there that corresponds to one specific transaction. This specific transaction, what's the date here? 2010 happens to be the first transaction that involved a physical good. Happened to be 2 pizzas, where an individual basically said, "Hey, I'll pay you in Bitcoin." He happened to offer 10,000 Bitcoin for 2 pizzas, and someone took him up on that, and the individual paid the 10,000 Bitcoins, and he received the 2 pizzas. Of course, at the time, back in 2010, that wasn't worth much at all. It was equivalent of maybe $25 or something along those lines. Today, $7 million. So, of course, fairly expensive pizzas. So one of the individuals that, the name of the individual who actually paid the 10,000 Bitcoin, we know who this person is. It happens to be by the name of Laszlo. And the individual that first transacted with Laszlo, I don't know the name of that person, but Laszlo did it again with a couple additional pizzas, and that person actually lives in Chicago and is a trader here, has been a trader, trading on the CME Group and many other exchanges here, and now also trades Bitcoin as well. So a little Chicago tie for us. This ugly block of data here happens to be the actual underlying data of the very first Bitcoin transaction that ever occurred. Again, getting to this transparency, we can go and see all of this data. That website that we just looked to kind of pull out some of this data and formalize it, make it a little bit easier to read. But one of the important things that I want to call out is that this is the very first transaction ever published on the Bitcoin network, and there was actually a little bit of additional information, at the time fairly superfluous, that wasn't actually terribly meaningful to the transaction itself. This transaction, of course, was published by whoever Satoshi was, and included a little bit of additional information in there, just a blurb of text that says the chancellor on brink of second bailout for banks. It turns out that the date of that first Bitcoin transaction happened to occur the same time the Times published a newspaper with that as the title, the headline title in their article. So again, this information maybe meant something to Satoshi. It wasn't terribly useful in some ways, but what it does actually point out is that this is a database where more information can be stored beyond just Bitcoin transactions. You can put other data in this database, which is kind of interesting because if we think about all of our various different parts of financial services and beyond, there are many, many different parts of the financial services industry where it's critical to maintain incredibly important, secure records. And we think about all of these different parts. Of course, Rumi touched on some of this with regard to exchanges, right? I mean, we have various different entities that are involved in that, the DTCC and so forth, maintaining these records of who owns what Apple equity at a given time and providing a way to update records, if you will, to assign ownership to another individual. And so if this database can store additional information, then wouldn't it be possible to actually now think about blockchains to store more than just history of transactions for Bitcoin, but also equities and debt, and even getting into other things like property title and records and so forth? And so this, I think, is going to be kind of the piece where I'll hand things off to Conrad in a minute to kind of go a bit deeper on these topics and talk about another network which is maybe even far more interesting than Bitcoin, which is starting to allow for what we refer to as smart contracts. So if we can all agree on the state of the world in a shared database, is it possible to somehow all work together in a peer-to-peer fashion to ensure that a certain block of code or set of instructions get executed at a future time to implement some type of contract, maybe a simple contract like an insurance contract or a weather contract or what have you? And it turns out we can. It turns out this technology does allow for that, and there's already networks that have been launched to do that. The one thing that I'll leave you with on kind of where this goes, I think we are in the incredibly early stages for this technology, and even what I've described here is certainly in the early days. But it's interesting to think about how this is going to evolve and what this means for kind of our global economy and different people across the world. This is basically just simple Google Trends data of those where the highest maybe adoption, if you will, for Bitcoin back in 2012, before I even knew about this technology and that it existed. We see pretty much all of the developed world there, for the most part, in the top 7. If we look today, developed world isn't on the list really at all. It's all the developing world, which is now at the top of the list for these new technologies. And potentially goes back to what we learned about before, where they don't have the US financial system that is actually quite fantastic relative to other parts of the world. It's interesting to think about where we're going to see this type of technology adopted first. Is it going to be the developed world, or is it going to be other parts of the world looking to find value on an open platform like this? Thanks.
Thank you.